What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. So this is gonna be a little bit different video than what I normally shoot, but I thought it was kind of pertinent. So unless you've been living under a rock, you are familiar with the devastation that Hurricane Helene has caused down in the southeast of the United States, particularly hard hit, North Carolina, Tennessee, places like that. And it's kind of come to our attention that radio plays a much bigger role in preparedness than people have thought about. And that's kind of come to light as I've been listening to the net down there on the local repeater. So Dan, K2DMG, who's I think he's in Mooresville, he's been running a net pretty much non-stop for the past week, because we're on day like 7 or 8 now. And Dan's been running that net pretty much non-stop, handling traffic in and out, health and welfare, coordinating rescues, food and water, all kinds of stuff. And I gotta say, Dan, if you ever watch this, the whole ham radio community is impressed with the way you have handled this situation. You've done a fantastic job. Hats off to you. You deserve all the accolades you've been getting. But I want to talk a little bit about the idea of radio in preparedness in general, and some of the things you need to consider. And some of these things have really come to light in the past week when I've seen how ham radio has been used to communicate within the community, to outside the community, and even nationwide. So I've got a bunch of stuff behind me that are things you might want to think about if you're thinking about radio for preparedness, right? I mean, there are people down in North Carolina right now where their only access to the outside world is ham radio. Thomas, K4SWL. Thomas lives on top of a mountain in Swananoa, all right? He has been running radio comms for his entire neighborhood. He has internet and power because he's got solar and he's got satellite internet, but most of the people down there don't have anything. So, having radio can be a lifeline. And before I talk about any of the stuff behind me and some of the things you need to think about, I want to address licensing, because there are people who are like, I'm not going to bother getting a license. If it's an emergency, I'll hop on the radio and use it. And people have done that down in North Carolina, and nobody's given anybody a hard time about it. Never once have I heard anybody say, oh, you're not licensed, get off the repeater. It's, okay, this is an emergency, what can we do to help you? And that's how it should be. The problem is, if you're not licensed, it's very hard to practice any of this stuff. And the time to learn how to use these things, the time to learn how to program repeaters, the time to find out if you can actually hit that repeater, not only open the squelch, but actually be heard, or the time to figure out how to set up an NVIS antenna and get on 80 meters at night and be able to work HF, those aren't things you do on the fly. These are things you have to practice, right? What's propagation like during different times of the day? What portions of the band should you be using? Those kinds of things aren't things you can just figure out as you go. They take practice. So I would recommend that, if you're considering radio for your preparedness, I would strongly encourage you to get licensed. Even if you only get a ham radio technician license, or even a GMRS license. Now, GMRS is going to be a little more limited, and we're going to talk about that. But realistically, I would recommend you get your general, because that'll open up all of the HF stuff as well. And we'll talk about when you might want to use what. But that is something you need to consider. This is not the kind of thing you just pick up and run with. Now, there are companies out there, businesses out there that do a good job of giving you turnkey solutions for radios, like Evan over at Radio Made Easy. Good name, by the way, Evan. He sends out pre-programmed, ready to go radios that you just set up and go. But even then, right, you need to know how to program your local repeaters in. You still need to understand what time of the day for what band, what frequency you should be using. Even within the band, where should you be in that band space? Those aren't things you can figure out on the fly. Okay, so I would strongly encourage you to get licensed, get on the air, and practice this stuff. Now, I've got a lot of stuff behind me on my tailgate here. This is my studio for the day. And I've got a lot of things here that I want to talk about. Some of this stuff is more important than others, and I've got some stuff here as more of a cautionary tale of things you might not want to worry about going down the rabbit hole of. Now, obviously, the first thing that everybody's going to think of when they come to comms are cell phones, and this is indispensable, right? If the cell network is up, you're good. Down in North Carolina and Tennessee and parts of Georgia and whatnot, there's no cell service. Even with the cellular on wheels they've got up, self-service is spotty at best, and for days there was nothing, okay? Don't rely on a cell phone for emergency comms. Now, the current version of iOS that just came out does have in beta satellite messaging. It's a little sketchy. I've seen it in action. It works. I would not want to rely on that as my sole means of emergency communication. I'm sure down the road, satellite comms are going to become much more robust and much easier to use. Even so, I'm going to tell you right now that radio is going to have a place in disaster communications that cell phones can't really replicate. Okay, so obviously we've got a phone. The other thing that I might encourage you to do, especially if you spend any time outdoors, is get a satellite messenger. So this is a Garmin InReach Mini. There are all sorts of different versions of this. There's different Garmins, there's Zoleo, there are a bunch of companies. Now these require a subscription, okay? But this will do SMS and email over satellites. I can flip this little door on the side and long press that SOS button and it'll call help. So if you're stranded on the top of a mountain, can't get out, no food, no water, no cell service, no internet, no power, no nothing, I flip that open, I hit that button, they at least know I'm there. Now it might be a while before they come to get me, but they know I'm there and they know I'm alive, right? And a lot of the communications, a lot of the traffic we've heard on this network is health and welfare. Like, hey, can you go find out if Jimmy Jones on 123 4th Street is alive? And they'd get out on their repeater and Dan would say, hey, is there anybody in this town who lives near this street who can go check on this person and see if they're alive, right? So just getting the word out to know that, hey, I'm alive, I'm not dead, can be crucial. So this is a hard thing to replace, okay? This thing is waterproof. The battery lasts a long time. That's its sole job, right? You can do navigation with it too, but its primary purpose is emergency communications. Again, this is great if you're stuck, but if you're trying to communicate within your community or with other people, this is not the best tool. Yeah, I can send SMS over satellite with it. It's a little clunky, but it'll get the job done. Now, before I get into the ham radio stuff behind me, one thing that I will talk about briefly is having an AM/FM radio that can run off multiple power sources. So this particular radio, I've had this thing, 20 years probably. This can take batteries, so it can take AA batteries. It has a 12-volt DC jack on the side, so I can plug it into power, and it has a hand crank, okay? So I can power this multiple ways. This might be your only means of getting news for an extended period of time. These things are dirt cheap. Go on Amazon, grab whatever radio you want that's got a hand crank, it takes batteries, stick this in your preparedness kit, and if and when the time comes, God forbid it ever does, you've got this. I have used this. In 2011, we had a really bad flood here, and I was basically on an island. My house didn't really flood, but you couldn't get out. All of the roads were blocked off. The only way you could get out of here was to ride a mountain bike up over the hill and down around, or I could drag my kayak out, plop it in the water, and paddle out. That was the only ways you were getting out. And there was really no power or no news to speak of. So this thing, I used this constantly during that. Now let's talk about radios. There are going to basically be 2 or 3 different things you're going to want to consider. The first thing is line of sight, close quarters communication. All right. You don't have to spend a ton of money on this, although I will say the better the radio, the better your audio and the better your receive quality is going to be, things like that. But realistically, it's not going to make a heck of a lot of difference. You don't need to spend a pile of money. And I have a whole bunch of radios behind me, and I don't want to overwhelm anybody with the radios I have. I have each radio here for a reason, okay? So I'm going to start with some of the things that you shouldn't buy. So I've got this Yaesu FT65 right here. I love this radio. This would not be the radio I would use for emergency communications for one big reason. The only way this radio can be charged is in a charging cradle. Okay, so it's got to be plugged into a charging cradle. Now, some of those charging cradles can take a 12-volt barrel adapter. Some can't. Some are just hardwired. You've got to plug it into the wall. If you don't have power and you don't have a generator or any means to generate, electricity, I would not recommend this style radio. Not because this isn't a good radio. For the money, this is a great radio. But it only charges via the charging cradle. This does not have USB-C, it doesn't have USB micro, it doesn't have a 12-volt barrel jack, nothing. This has to sit in a cradle to charge. That's a big drawback. So if you're buying a radio with emergency preparedness in mind, I wouldn't buy something that has to charge in a cradle, no matter how good the radio is. Okay, so that's just something to consider. The other radio I've got behind me, this is my favorite radio. So this is my FT5DR. This is a Yaesu. I love this radio. This is a very expensive radio. This is IP67, so it's waterproof. You can throw it in the water, pick it up, it'll still work. This is a dual band UHF VHF radio, just like this guy is. All right. This will do APRS, although APRS in an emergency situation is probably not super useful. You could send out an emergency beacon over APRS, but if there's no digipeaters up, it's of limited usefulness. All right. This radio, however, will charge via 12 volts right here. There is a barrel jack. Now I can charge this multiple different ways. Okay, I'll talk about charging in a minute, but this radio I can charge on the fly. Okay, now this radio is not what's called Mars modded. This is locked to the ham frequencies. So I can only use this on 2 meter and 70 centimeter ham frequencies. Now the nice thing about this radio, it is wideband receive. This will listen to everything. Okay, so that's something you might want to consider is when you're buying a radio, you might want to consider what frequencies can it receive on. Not just what it can transmit on, but what can I listen to? This will listen to just about anything. Everything from AM broadcast and shortwave all the way up through, you know, really high, ultra high frequency stuff and everything in between. Airband, you name it, this will do it. All right. It'll do, you can listen to NOAA weather radio with it, all sorts of stuff. FM broadcast. Okay. You can receive all of those things. So that's something to consider. Now, this is not the kind of radio I tell most people to go out and buy for emergency preparedness. This is a Ham Radio Geeks radio. This is like a $450 radio. I do have an extended battery for this as well. All right, so this is a much bigger radio. Or I'm sorry, a much bigger battery. This thing lasts forever. The battery life on this thing is not incredible, but it's not horrible. Okay, but the extended battery lasts a long time, so that's something you might want to consider as well, is extra batteries for your handheld radios, because these are going to be your lifeline. The handheld radios, line of sight communication, these are what are going to allow you to communicate around your community and outside your community through repeaters. Okay, now that repeater network is only as good as the power. If the power to the repeater goes out, now you have no beyond line of sight communication, right? That repeater can be up high on a mountain. So for instance, the Mount Mitchell repeater they've been using down in North Carolina, Mount Mitchell's the highest point on the East Coast. It's the highest point east of the Mississippi River. And that repeater has been the lifeline. That gets out all over North Carolina, Tennessee. I think you can get into Virginia and South Carolina even. I mean, it covers a wide area, okay? But without those repeaters, these radios are line of sight. If you can't see the other antenna, you're probably not going to talk to it, okay? From my house here, I can, on these handheld 5-watt radios, talk to my mom's house, which is 4.7 miles away as the crow flies, pretty reliably. But I have direct line of sight from my house to her house. She lives on top of a hill, and there's nothing between my house and her house, all the way down the valley to the hill. So that's something you've got to keep in mind. The next radio I've got here is a VGC VRN76. This is a cool radio. These are not super expensive. These are like $180. The reason I have this radio here is, now this will do GPS, so will the FT5, so you can get your GPS location and everything with this radio. So if you're trying to tell somebody where you are, this will give GPS coordinates, as will this. This is also IP67 waterproof. This also has APRS. Again, it's a dual band, 2 meter, 70 centimeter ham radio. However, this one is Mars modded, and I don't want to hear anybody crying and complaining about unlocking radios. If you're not transmitting on out-of-band frequencies, it's not a big deal. But in an emergency, I want to be able to talk to somebody on a GMRS or FRS radio or a MERS radio, right? I don't care about the rules at that point, okay? So yes, this radio is pretty much, I think every other radio behind me besides those two Yaesus are Mars. No, in fact, this is too. This Yaesu is Mars modded also. The only one behind me that is not, and of the ham radios, is the FT5. Okay, so this will transmit on ham radio, GMRS, FRS, MERS, anything in the 2 meter, 70 centimeter area. Again, IP67, GPS. This radio, the reason I have this radio here is because it charges on USB Type-C. Okay, that is one of those things that I'm just going to tell you, if you can get a radio that charges Type-C, you can understand the benefit of that. You can charge it off any of your charging bricks you charge your phone with. All right, I can charge it off solar panels, which we'll talk about in a minute. Right, Type-C, or any USB for that matter, but especially Type-C, because Type-C is sort of universal. That right there, this is IP67, 2 meter, 70 centimeter, easily Mars modded. It's unlocked super easy. USB-C, GPS, right? Like I said, this radio is awesome, okay? The next radio I have behind me, so this is a TYT. This is a DMR radio. This radio is a 10 watt radio, so this is a higher output radio. This is really an LMR radio. This isn't really a ham radio, but it works on ham radio frequencies. Again, this is an LMR radio, so it'll transmit on anything in the 2 meter and 70 centimeter band. This radio probably isn't what I would buy, unless you have, DMR close by, and even then, when the internet goes out, DMR outside of line of sight isn't going to work. But again, this radio charges via USB-C. Okay, so again, I have this radio out here because this one charges via USB-C, and it is waterproof. This is an IP67 water. I think this is a UV something 390. I forget what the model number of this is. But again, this is more like an LMR radio, land mobile radio, like a commercial radio. But this would work. You could use this. It probably wouldn't be my first choice, but it would get the job done. Now, let's go to, unfortunately, what we're going to just tell everybody to buy. If you're looking for emergency radios, as much as everybody hates on these things, go buy a whole bunch of Baofeng UV5Rs and call it a day. They are not waterproof. They are not that tough. They are pretty chintzy. The thing is, though, they're dirt cheap. This radio is 17 bucks. If it breaks, I don't care. All right? I just packed my BNC full of dirt. I can unpack that and pull it right back out again. But that's the thing. These things are dirt cheap. This radio's 17 bucks. Now, here's the thing about this radio. See, I'm a moron. Now I packed that full of dirt. Not that it really matters all that much. Here's the thing about this radio. This radio, and you'll see the antenna that I had on, is a signal stick. This is a 220 signal stick. This particular Baofeng and this one are Triband radios. These will do 2 meters, 1.25 meters, and 70 centimeters. Okay, now you might say, well, that's of limited usefulness, right? Nobody uses 220. Well, that's part of the idea. If I'm here at home and I need to be able to communicate with my family, and I don't want all the frequencies I'm using clogged up, I'm going to use 220 because nobody else is. All right, so. Yeah, it's going to take a while to get all that garbage out of there. Let me grab a stick off the ground and see if we can dig it out while I'm talking. There we go. We're back in business. So these Tribanders are cool because, again, I can hop on 220, and my wife and my daughter and I could talk on 1.25 centimeters, or 1.25 meters, I'm sorry, and probably have the whole band to ourselves. Now, this particular UV5R, I have a USB Type-C charging battery on it. Okay, now these don't come like that. I bought these separate, okay? Again, I think that's important to be able to charge that battery on the fly from USB-C. This right here, you don't even need the tri-band, just a dual band, 2 meter, 70 centimeter UV5R for 15 bucks. Buy a whole bunch of these, program them ahead of time, pass them out. We're gonna talk about programming in a minute, okay? I got a bug walking across my lens. I apologize for that. You'll probably see him walk across the lens. But as much as everybody hates on these UV5Rs, if you're going to be passing radios out, or you just want a radio that you don't want to break the bank with, these things work. I just threw this thing across the yard, and I guarantee you if I turn it on, it works. Okay? So they're not the greatest radio in the world, but they absolutely get the job done. Don't let anybody tell you they won't. Don't listen to the people who are the naysayers, like, oh, don't buy those things, they're junk. Yeah, they're not the greatest radios ever, but they work, and they're ubiquitous. Right? There are so many of these things out there, you're probably going to be able to find batteries for these things, right? So your battery's dead. There are so many of these things around, you'll probably be able to find spare parts for them. This one, I've got a Smiley, this is a tri-band antenna, so it'll work 2 meters, 70 centimeters, and 1.25 meters, depending on how many portions of the telescope I put up. So that's a quarter wave on 2 meters. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a quarter wave on 220. It's a quarter wave on 440. It'll also do 5/8 wave on 440. This one also has an extended battery, so you can see how much bigger the battery is on this radio than this radio. Okay? This one doesn't charge via USB-C. It's got a 12-volt barrel adapter in the side. They do make these with Type-C now also. That's what I would buy, is these extended batteries with a Type-C. That would get the job done. like I said, it's hard to argue with these things. They're dirt cheap and they work. All right. Now, before I talk about the other radios I have here, let me briefly talk about antennas. Okay, antennas are more important than the radio. I've got a signal stick here. This is a dual band signal stick. This will work 2 meters and 70 centimeters. All right, these things work awesome. If you are trying to work 2 meters and you really want to reach out and touch someone, these are both 2 meter half wave antennas. This is an old MFJ Long Ranger. MFJ doesn't exist anymore, but if you can find one of these antennas, they are amazing. They work so well. Okay, now they're fragile. It's not the kind of thing you want to leave on the radio all the time, but if you really need to reach out, this is a signal stick, half wave 2 meter. These are available. It is just about as good as I find the MFJ works a little bit better, but the Smiley is flexible, which is kind of cool. Okay, antenna, antenna, antenna. I can't say that. I can't stress that enough. The antenna is probably the most important part of the whole radio. I've heard a lot of people down there in North Carolina probably on a UV5R with a stock rubber duck, and they are very hard to make out. All right, those stock antennas are, I mean, they work, but they're not amazing. All right, if you buy an HT, even a cheap one, buy a good antenna. The antenna makes a huge, huge difference. Buy a roll-up J-pole and stick it in a box so you've got it. I'd show you mine, but mine's actually up right now. That's actually my Shack 2 meter, 70 centimeter antenna is a N9TX roll-up J-pole outside the house, okay? So like I said, for the bang for the buck, easy, you know, these things are easy to use. Like I said, you can get all sorts of accessories for them, USB-C batteries. You buy a whole bunch of them. And, you know, I could buy 10 of these radios, 10 batteries, and 10 antennas, and it's still not as expensive as this one radio. Is it as good? No. Does it work? Absolutely. If I turn this thing on and key up right now, I'll hit the repeater, no problem. Oh, now I've got a yellow jacket flying around the camera. That's fun. So, like I said, it's hard to argue. As much as people hate on these things, it is hard to argue with the UV5R. Buy a bucket load of these things, program them up, and just have them ready to roll. And if things ever go sideways, you just hand these things out. All right, I'd recommend you lock them first so people aren't messing with the programming. But once you've got them programmed, hit that lock key so they can't play with anything and just hand them out. Okay? Now, let's talk GMRS for a minute. So I've got 3 different GMRS radios here. GMRS, or the General Mobile Radio Service, works on UHF. So it's very similar to 70 centimeter ham. UHF doesn't work as well in like hilly wooded terrain as VHF will, but it will work. I can talk to my mom's house from my house 4.7 miles away with just a cheap 5-watt GMRS radio. I've done it. The nice thing about GMRS is that also can use repeaters, and there's no test for the license. It's just $35. So if you're really having aversion to taking the test, get a GMRS license, get some GMRS radios, get them programmed up for your local GMRS repeaters, assuming you have them. And, you know, that will at least get you some comms. There will probably be a lot of people on GMRS because they share frequencies of the FRS radios. I've got 3 GMRS radios with me right now. This is a Woshin KGUV9G Pro. This is a great radio. This does not have the stock battery on it though, because guess what? I bought an aftermarket. Actually, it's a Woshin, but it's a add-on, and it has a USB Type-C charging port on it. Now, the one thing I'm going to tell you about this radio, let's do things. 1, the screen is hard to read in the sun, and 2, this has a parasitic draw. So if you leave the battery on this radio all the time, it will draw it down. So if you're going to store this, take the battery off the radio. Don't leave it on the radio. I've got a Smiley 5/8 wave GMRS antenna on this thing. This antenna is fantastic. Again, antenna, antenna, antenna. I have a Woshin KG-S88G. This is again, GMRS radio. This is USB Type-C charging, and it is IP67 waterproof. This guy is not. This is not a waterproof radio. This one is. I can take this thing, I can drop this in the water, pick it back up, and use it again. Okay, this is the radio I use when I'm like kayaking, because if I plop it in the water, it doesn't matter. In fact, I've done it. These are both great radios. They're super het. Good receivers. They're probably the best type of GMRS radios you're going to get, these Woshins. Not super cheap. This is like $150. This is like $140. All right, but again, Belfang to the rescue. And I've got a slew of different Baofeng GMRS radios, but this is a GM UV15 Pro. I think this is like $22 on Amazon. They make a ham version of this too, which looks identical, but it's a 2 meter 70 centimeter radio. I've got a Nagoya 701G on this. Again, decent antenna. All right, these will work also. Remember that just like anything else, you need to know how these things work ahead of time. You don't want to have to figure out how this thing works on the fly. If you pick one of these radios up and try to program it and have no idea what you're doing to get it to hit into a repeater, you're gonna have a hard time. All right, trying to figure out how to set the frequency offset and the which direction that offset is and the PL tones for the repeater, all those kinds of things, right? If you don't know how to do those, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's exactly what I mean. Learn this stuff ahead of time. Okay, because this radio doesn't do you any good if you don't know how to. You don't just turn it on and hit the push to talk button and say, somebody help me. Okay, it's not that simple. You need to know how to program it, what frequencies to be on, and that's different area to area. Okay, so a repeater frequency here is probably not going to be the same as a repeater frequency 50 miles away. Okay, they're not going to be on the same inputs. They're going to be different frequencies. You need to know those things. Look on places like Repeater Reference, or Radio Reference, or Repeater Book. All right, that will give you those repeater frequencies and the offsets and the tones and all those things. Okay, but the time to learn how to do that stuff is not when you are having an emergency. The time to learn how to do that stuff is beforehand. Learn how to program the radio. Use it. Understand how it works. Understand what repeaters you can and can't hit. Understand that just because you can break the squelch on a repeater, just because I push to talk and I hear the repeater answer me back, either with just a squelch, like a tone, or if you hear the repeater identify itself, just because you hear that does not mean that if I talk into this thing, someone's going to hear me at the repeater. I'll break the squelch, but all they might hear is static. Okay, so you got to know how to do all those things. You need to know. I need to know which repeaters here can I hit. I know in this area which repeaters are going to be used for emergencies, and I know I can hit them. All right. The two that I know they're going to get used is N2IOW and WA2QEL. I know those repeaters are going to get used. I can hit both of them no problem from my house. They're all programmed into all of my radios. I also have simplex frequencies, or non-repeater, direct radio-to-radio frequencies plugged into these things. The national calling frequencies, 14652, 44600. All right. Have all of those things programmed in. Have a separate simplex frequency for you and your family and your friends that's different from everybody else. Don't use 14652 that nobody else is probably going to be on. So you can talk amongst yourselves without getting stepped on. Okay? Now, most of the communications that you're going to need are probably going to be local, 2 meter, 70 centimeter, line of sight, or repeater type stuff. However, if you really want to get information out, that is where HF, or high frequency radio, is going to come in. So we're using much lower frequencies than these handhelds. Okay, this is really not the beginner's kind of thing. You don't just pick up an HF radio and push the button and go. This takes a lot of learning. You have to understand what bands to use, what frequency to use, what time of day, what time of year to use different bands. How high does your antenna need to be? How long does your antenna need to be? How is the ground conductivity going to affect that antenna? There's a million things that go into that. So if you think you want to be able to do long distance beyond line of sight comms, when I'm talking HF, I can do anything from my next door neighbor to Australia on HF. Okay, it's beyond line of sight, and I can talk to pretty much anybody in the world with enough power, the right antenna, and the right propagation, the right band, the right time of day. Again, there's a whole lot that goes into this. Okay, so I've got 3 different HF setups behind me. Okay, I've got this is my KX2 set. You guys have seen this on my channel before. If you haven't, I've got a video specifically going through this kit. Actually, I have 2 of them. This radio is a QRP. It's a 10 watt all mode radio. Everything is in this to get on the air. I've got the radio, I've got a battery, I've got an extra battery, I have 2 antennas, it's got a built-in microphone, I've got a CW key in here, I have everything you could possibly need to get on the air in this radio. I can be on the air and transmitting in under 5 minutes with this radio. On the air, going. Okay, I've got vertical antennas, I've got horizontal antennas. This radio's got an internal tuner, so if my antenna happens to break, I can probably still tune that wire up and get it to transmit. Okay, very expensive. there are several $1,000s worth of stuff in this little tiny bag. Just the radio itself is $1,600. Again, this is probably not the kind of thing a beginner is going to want to even think about buying. However, if you are a licensed ham radio operator and you want to be able to really help people in a disaster, being able to set up a portable HF station on the fly at a distribution center or at the top of a mountain to get comms out, that's important. I've been listening to that repeater down there, and they've been talking about the Pota Soda guys down there who they're going to wherever and setting up their Pota rig or their soda rig and passing traffic in and out, right? If all you do is ever sit in your shack with your 100-watt radio and your big antenna and your power supply, and you never leave the shack and don't know how to set one of these things up fast and don't have any little field radios, that's going to make you limited usefulness in that kind of situation, okay? Again, I'm not talking to people who are just getting into this stuff. I'm talking to people who are hams, who have a general license or an extra license, and maybe they're thinking about, man, if the power goes out, my $10,000 flex radio setup with my great big Yagi is pretty much useless unless I got a generator, okay? And even then, we're going to talk in a minute about power draw. That's something you got to consider too. I've also got in this kit, this is my TX500 kit. So there are multiple videos on my channel about the TX500, and this is everything you need to get on the air: the radio, battery, the antenna, the mic, everything is in here, okay? The one thing I don't have out here, they forgot to bring out, is my little ZM2 tuner. You might want to consider buying a Z-Match tuner because they don't require any battery power, okay? A tuner that requires battery is great until you don't have power, okay? So consider, if you're using a radio that doesn't have an internal tuner, you might want to consider buying a little Z-Match tuner just in case you have an antenna that won't tune up and your SWR is crazy high. That might help. Okay, but this is a complete kit. I can take this, go into the field beyond the air in 5 minutes. All right. Again, very expensive. There are a couple of grand worth of stuff in this bag also. What most people, if you want a field radio, and again, people are going to whine and cry about the Chinese radios, but dude, I'll tell you what, go buy a G90. 20 watts, all mode, all the HF bands. This thing's bomb-proof. You cannot argue with one of these G90s. People will whine and cry about, they're cheap Chinese junk. I have made so many contacts on this radio, it's not even funny, okay? If you want to be prepared, go get your general license, buy a G90, a whole bunch of Baofangs, and this thing's $450. For less than $600, you can have HF, VHF, UHF, and enough radios for multiple people. All right? Go buy a G90. This thing will do everything you could possibly need it to do in an emergency, and you can see it is not huge. Okay? It's 20 watts, so it's more power. The other two radios are 10-watt radios. So doubling the power gives us half an S unit of signal strength, which isn't much. That might be the difference between being heard and not being heard. Okay, now along with your HF radio, obviously you're going to need something to power it. Dude, go on Amazon, buy yourself a cheap, this is a 6 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery. You can run that radio all day long. For over a year, my shack rig was that G90, and I had 2 of these, and I would alternate them every day. I would charge one would be on the charger while the other one was being used. I'd run that radio all day long on one of these 6 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries. At the end of the night, I'd swap batteries, put the other one on the charger. You can run this thing all day, and that was at 20 watts. If I turn that thing down to 5 watts, I could run a long time on this little battery, right? And we need an antenna. Now, you don't need to go out and spend $1 million on an antenna. Okay, I've got some verticals here. I've got a 17-foot vertical. Great. Problem with the vertical, and I've got a Gable, which is also a multiband vertical. The problem with the vertical is if you're trying to work local comms, NVIS, near vertical incident skywave, these don't work real well for that stuff. Wire antennas are probably what you're going to want. I'm not saying don't get a vertical antenna, but don't have it be your only antenna. And again, you don't need to go out and spend $1 million. I have right here a 2040 link dipole made with speaker wire and a BNC binding post. It is taped, so it's waterproof, on coax, and that whole thing right there is maybe $20 for the parts. Cheap coax, cheap BNC binding post, speaker wire head kicking around. This even has the guy lines attached to it and the insulators and everything. Like I said, maybe $20 here, $25, including the coax. Okay, this will work 20 meters and 40 meters. The G90 will tune this on 80 meters because I've done it. And this, you put this thing up, so it's, I don't know, 10, 15 feet off the ground, and I can work the guy in the next town over or the next state over, get it up a little higher, put it on 20 meters. Dude, you can work Asia with it. Okay, so again, you don't need to go crazy on this stuff. Now, a couple more things I want to talk about real quick. Having your own repeater can be helpful. This is just a little Surecom duplex repeater. This is technically a crossband repeater, so your input would be on one band and your output would be on the other, like a 2 meter and 70 centimeter. However, I've run this on straight 2 meter or straight 70 centimeter single band duplex, and it works great. 2 Baofeng EV5Rs. It comes with cables for a Kenwood style plug. You plug those guys in. It's got a 12 volt jack, but here's the cool thing. This has an internal battery too. So even if the power's out, this will continue to work, okay? And this will extend the range of your radio dramatically. You hook this thing up to a cheap UV5R that's hooked to an external antenna. It could be a mag mount car antenna or a roll up J pole. You just extended the range of your radio network drastically. $50. Okay, you can buy legit repeaters too, but that's a little excessive for this kind of stuff. Power. Let's talk about thinking about our power solutions here. Okay, so I've got a number of things behind me here. This little package here, I've just got a little 10,000 milliamp hour USB PD power bank. It's got USB-A's, a USB micro, and a USB-C, and it will run USB-C power delivery, which means I can run more than just regular 5-volt USB out of this thing. I have a 12-volt trigger cable in here, and I have multiple barrel jacks in here. I can run my KX2 off of this. I can run the TX500 off of this. I can charge my radios behind me that have barrel connectors. So my FT5, I can charge off of this. This Baofeng with the barrel jack connector there, I can charge off of this. Okay, I've got a USB-C cable in here. I have a USB micro cable in here. All right, this kind of thing takes up no space, and this will charge one of those radios multiple times. It'll charge your phone, right? And you can go much bigger than this. This one's tiny. This is one of my little Poda Soda setups. Okay, but you can go much bigger than this. I've got a little, these are just cheap off Amazon battery bank with solar panel. This one doesn't just have a single solar panel. This one has fold-out solar panels, right? Those ones that just have the little single panel on it, they take days to charge. This one charges pretty quick because it's got a lot of surface area on those photovoltaic cells. All right, we've got our USB down here. We've got 2 Type A's and a Type C. All right. Yeah, I mean, dirt cheap. I forget what I paid for it on Amazon, but it was not expensive at all. Something like that might save you in a pinch. Okay. Jump packs. Now this one's huge. Okay, these Noco lithium jump packs. I've got one that's like a third of the size of this one for most cars. This will jump big diesels. This is a 3,000 amp. This thing's a monster. But this again has USB and 12 volt in and out. I can run stuff on this thing forever. This thing will power stuff, I mean, an insane amount of time, and it'll jump your car, right? So, you know, this kind of thing, super useful, and it's got a light on it. Solar panel. This is a Bioenno. I can put this in my backpack. All right. And this, I have charged these 6 amp hour lithium iron phosphate batteries on this guy. I'll have one on the solar charger while the other one's running the radio, and then I swap them out. This will keep them topped off all day long. Just this little solar panel. In here I've got a Genasun solar charge controller for lithium batteries, and I've got USB cables. I have barrel connectors. So I've got this wired up with Anderson power poles, and I've got all these adapters in here. I just plug into the Anderson power poles and charge. The solar charge adapter actually has, the solar panel itself has USB out, so you can plug a USB directly into the solar panel without the charge controller. All right, but if you're going to charge any of your 12 volt stuff, there's your solar charge controller. I've taken this camping with me, and I will keep my radios up and running the whole time I'm camping without ever having any sort of outside power source. And if you're running a radio that's efficient, and this is important, if you're running a radio that's efficient, you can keep them going all day on these little tiny batteries, okay? Something like this TX500 or my KX2. The TX500 in here, really low current on receive, really low. It's not super high on output, on transmit either, because it's a QRP radio, it's low power. But that's something else you want to consider. You probably don't want to drag your big shack radio out into the field. I mean, you could, right? I could drag my FTDX10 out, or even like, let's say an 891, right? That's a field radio, but it's got high current draw. You need a big battery. Even when you're running that thing low power, it draws a lot of current on receive. That's something to consider as well. But again, we're getting a little off in the weeds here as far as what people actually need to consider. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is digital, because the AARL will harp on, or the ARRL, sorry, will harp on digital modes, WinLink, blah, blah, blah. Okay, digital has its place. WinLink has its place. It is probably not the primary thing you're going to want to use in an emergency. Most of what you're going to be using in an emergency is a bunch of handheld radios, working simplex, and then net control through a relay, right? To run digital, you're going to need some sort of digital interface. You either need a radio with a sound card, or you're going to need something like a DigiRig. Right, this is the one for the G90. And the big problem is then I need a computer, and I've got to keep this charged. And even the efficient ones of these are pretty power hungry, okay? And WinLink is not super easy to use. If you've never used WinLink, it can be finicky. Ham radio software in general is a pain in the butt to set up. Just be prepared for that. You know, you've got WinLink, which is the client, and then you've got to have your modem like Vera, and it's not super easy, okay? WinLink is not for beginners, and you're going to hear people, oh, WinLink in emergencies. Okay, yeah, I can get email out. Realistically, though, I'm going to be honest with you. I probably even wouldn't touch WinLink unless I wanted to, like, let's say, email my mom and tell her I was alive. Most of what I'm going to be on is grabbing a handheld radio like this guy and talking to everybody else in the neighborhood. And then if I really need to get information out, I'm going to be on an HF radio on NVIS on 40 or 80 meters for regional communications. Okay, so like I said, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here to think about, and I hope I didn't overwhelm you. If you're new to this, let me just say this. It seems complicated. It doesn't need to be. Go find someone or a course or a person, an Elmer, whoever, who will teach you how to set these things up. Go get your license and use it. All right? Programming these radios is not hard, but it does take a little bit of understanding as to what you're doing. All right? HF is a whole different ballgame. If you're going to get into the HF stuff, that's going to take some practice. Okay? But for these handhelds, UHF, VHF, go buy a bunch of cheap UV5Rs, program them up with the local repeaters, some simplex channels, and get on the air. And again, understand that in an emergency, you don't have to be licensed. So if you pick up somebody's radio and use it, nobody's going to give you a hard time. Just understand that if you still got a UV5R that you bought from Amazon and it's still sitting in the box and you've never taken it out of the box and played with it, you're never going to be able to figure out how to set this thing up and get it to work in an emergency. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I've been thinking about over the past week as I've been glued to that net. I've listened to it every day. I've heard Thomas on there multiple times. So Thomas, if you're watching this, we've all been hearing you on that repeater, and it's surreal to say the least. I cannot imagine what you guys are going through. I heard your daughter Geneva on there as well. I can't even fathom what you're all going through, but at least you have the ability to communicate. And at the end of the day, being able to call in and say, hey, we're stuck, our road is washed out, we got no food, we got no water, or we've got somebody who's got a medical emergency or whatever. Having the ability to do that might be the difference between living and dying. All right. So at the end of the day, folks, yes, this is a fun hobby. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do. You can go out and be a poda dork like me and make beeps out of a radio, but someday it might save your life. All right. So thank you everybody for watching. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm you, and hopefully this gave you some things to think about that you might not have thought about before. If you have any interest in learning how to do any of this stuff, there's a lot of places you can reach out to. If you want to get your ham radio license, hamstudy.org is a great place. These signal sticks, when you buy one of these support hamstudy.org. You can go on there. They've got all the test questions, the test banks. You can take practice tests. And if you click explain, it will tell you why the answer is what it is, so you understand the theory as opposed to just rote memorization of the answers. All right. But again, having the gear is only half of the battle. You have to understand how to use it. And at the end of the day, there's only a few things that realistically you need. In an emergency, your health and fitness is priority number one. Right? If you are in bad shape, it's going to be much harder for you to survive. As horrible as that sounds, that is the reality of it. All right? And skills and knowledge. Nobody can take your knowledge from you. A flood can wash all of this crap away. The knowledge and skills that you have, unless this flood takes you out too, or the tornado takes you out too, you still have those skills. All right, if a flood came through and washed all this stuff away today, I know how to start fire. I know how to communicate. I know how to, you find an axe head. I can rehang an axe I can grab one of these hickories here and I can rehang an axe, okay? Some of those skills, can you sharpen a chainsaw? Do you know how to rebuild a carburetor on a chainsaw? Right, those kind of things that people don't think about until, oh crap, I've got trees down all over my yard and my saw won't start, or the chain is dull. Learn skills now. The time to learn how to do these things is not during the disaster, right? Do you know how to find fresh water? Do you know how to treat water that isn't potable? All these things that people don't think about until it's too late. Start thinking about them now. If anybody has any interest in it, I'll just throw this out there. I have a pretty wide skill set when it comes to this stuff. All right, I have a lot of bushcraft skills, survival type stuff. I'm not a prepper, I'm not one of those guys, but I enjoy being out in the woods and learning all these different skills. If anybody has any interest in me starting a channel on any of this stuff, I'm considering doing that just to sort of give people back some of this knowledge. I mean, I've been to a lot of schools, I've learned a lot of stuff, and you know, being able to pass on that information and maybe make a difference in somebody's life, and maybe being the difference between somebody living and somebody dying, right? That means the world. So, like I said, have the stuff, know how to use it. And again, before I end this video, Dan, I just want to give another shout out to you, K2DMG. The guy has been outstanding. You are a rock star. You are everything that ham radio MCOM should be. And with that, I think I'll sign off. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If I left anything out, go ahead and let me know in the comments. And again, thank you so much for watching. And as always, 7-3.